In the summer of 2013, in the interior of Alaska, along a river called Upward Sun, a team led by archaeologist Ben Potter brushed away the silt above an ancient hearth. Beneath it, they found two infants, buried together, roughly 11,500 years ago. Someone had grieved here. That part is human and simple. The problem came later in a lab, when the DNA of one of those babies pointed to a population no textbook had ever named. A people who had already been sitting in the north for thousands of years, waiting. And that baby was only the first crack. Let me tell you what makes this grave different from every other grave. For about 60 years, the story of how humans reached America was clean, almost suspiciously clean. People crossed from Siberia over a land bridge, walked south through a gap in the ice around 13,000 years ago, spread across 2 continents, and left behind a distinctive stone spear point first found near Clovis, New Mexico. That was the model. Clovis first. Nobody before Clovis. It was in the textbooks. It was on the museum walls. And for a long time, questioning it was a good way to end a career. Now look back at the hearth in Alaska. The 2 infants were named by the local native community connected to the region around Healy Lake. One was called Sunrise Girl Child, the other Dawn, Twilight Girl Child. That matters, and I'll come back to why it matters more than the science later. For now, hold on to the fact that these were people with names given by descendants who are still there. The bones went for analysis. The genome of the older infant, the one researchers labeled USR1, was sequenced by a team working with Eske Willerslev's lab in Copenhagen. And when the result came back, it did not fit any known branch of Native American ancestry. It wasn't northern, it wasn't southern, it was something older, something that had split off near the very beginning and then stopped. Researchers gave this population a name, ancient Beringians. Think about what that word is doing. It's not describing a family, it's describing a doorway. This child carried the signature of an entire population that had been in the far north for thousands of years and then essentially vanished from the later story. Not because they died at that hearth, because they'd been genetically invisible until this one baby handed them over. That's the first payoff, and it's a real one. Not a legend, not a maybe. A verified genome that said the peopling of America was not one clean wave walking briskly south. And here's the part that should sit with you. This discovery was celebrated. Nature published it. Headlines ran, "Nobody buried the Alaska find." So if you came here expecting a cover-up in Alaska, I have to be honest with you right away. The suppression story isn't here, it's older and it's uglier, and the baby is the thread that pulls you back into it. Because to understand why ancient Beringians were such a shock, you have to understand the wall they were smashing into. And that wall had already been under attack for decades by people who paid for it. The map moves now. South, almost to the bottom of the world. Monte Verde, Chile, 8,000 miles from that Alaskan land bridge. In the late 1970s, an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay began working a site there where soft, waterlogged peat had preserved things stone almost never let survive. Wooden tools, cordage, plant remains, the remains of a hide-covered structure, and the radiocarbon dates came back around 14,500 years. That was the problem. That date put people at the far southern tip of South America, roughly 1,000 years before Clovis first said the first Americans had even come through the gap in the ice up north. It was old. And it was old in completely the wrong place. You cannot walk from a Siberian land bridge to southern Chile in an afternoon. If people were in Monte Verde that early, then people were everywhere much earlier, and the whole clean timeline collapsed. So the field did what fields do when the evidence arrives before they're ready. It did not simply disagree, it came for the site. For years, the safer, easier answer was that Dillahay had gotten something wrong, that the layers were disturbed, that the dates were off, that the wooden artifacts weren't really artifacts. Contamination? That word is going to keep coming back because contamination is the most powerful tool in this entire story, and almost nobody talks about why. Calling a site contaminated doesn't require you to prove anything, it just requires the other person to disprove it. It flips the burden. It makes the discovery look reckless instead of the doubt looking lazy. It is the cleanest way to bury something without ever touching a shovel. Dillahay spent more than a decade defending Monte Verde. Then, in 1997, a group of leading archaeologists, including some skeptics, actually traveled to the site to examine it in person. And they agreed. The site was real, the date held. That was supposed to be the moment. The wall was supposed to fall. It didn't, not fully. And that tells you something about how this really works. Because the next site had been sitting under the same accusation for years, in a rock shelter in Pennsylvania, and its excavator was still fighting. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, a deep, layered site excavated by James Adovasio starting in the 1970s. And when I say layered, I mean this place is a masterpiece of stratigraphy. Floor after floor of human occupation, stacked like pages in a book, going down and getting older and older. Here's the courtroom logic, and it's simple. In an undisturbed site, the layer above is younger, the layer below is older. Anything sealed between two dated layers has to belong to that moment in time. It can't fall up. It can't sink down through solid sediment. It's locked in place, like something shut inside a drawer that hasn't been opened since. At Meadowcroft, the lowest human layers dated older than Clovis, possibly a lot older, past 16,000 years by some readings. And the objection? Contamination again. Critics argued that groundwater moving through the site had carried in ancient carbon from nearby coal deposits, making the dates look older than they really were. It was a reasonable thing to ask. That's what makes this hard. It wasn't a stupid objection. But here's what nagged. Adovasio and others kept checking. They looked for the coal particles that should have been there if that contamination were real. They studied the surrounding sediment, and the tidy contamination story never fully closed the case. It explained what it needed to explain and then left a residue of doubt that wouldn't wash out. This is the pattern I need you to see, because it's the actual engine of this whole thing, and it has nothing to do with a secret meeting. There was no cabal. Nobody signed a document agreeing to hide the peopling of America. What there was instead is more ordinary and honestly more dangerous. There was a model that worked, a model that had built careers, funded excavations, filled museum cases, and trained 2 generations of archaeologists to know what they'd find before they dug. And when your model is also your career, a new date doesn't feel like data. It feels like an attack. So the resistance didn't need villains. It ran on peer review that got a little harsher for pre-Clovis papers, on grant committees that found early sites a little riskier to fund, on the quiet knowledge, passed to every graduate student, that claiming a pre-Clovis date was a fast way to get a reputation for being careless. The easiest way to bury a discovery is not to destroy it. It's to make the person holding it look irresponsible. Do that long enough and you don't have to hide anything. The evidence just sits there, labeled as a mistake, while everyone moves on. For a long time, that worked. Monte Verde was a fluke. Meadowcroft was contaminated. Every early site was an isolated exception you could explain away one at a time. And then the debate stopped being about invisible molecules and radiocarbon math. It became something a child could understand. It became footprints. White Sands, New Mexico, a national park of blinding white gypsum dunes sitting over what used to be the shoreline of an ancient lake. And in the old lakebed mud, hardened and buried and then re-exposed, researchers found tracks, human footprints, not tools you have to argue about, not bones you can call intrusive, footprints. A person physically standing on that ground, walking across wet sediment, leaving the shape of their foot behind. And these weren't random. There were the prints of teenagers and children. One trail shows someone carrying a small child, setting it down, picking it back up. Alongside the human tracks, in the same surface, are the tracks of a giant ground sloth and a mammoth. Extinct Ice Age animals, walking the same lakeshore as these people. Then they dated the layers, using seeds from a water plant called Ruppia, found in the sediment. The result came back around 21 to 23,000 years ago. Read that again. Not 13,000, not 16. 21 to 23,000 years. That's not bending the timeline. That's driving through it. It would put people in New Mexico at the absolute height of the last ice age, when the ice sheets were at their maximum and the famous corridor south wasn't even open yet. So, how do you dismiss a footprint? You go after the date. And critics found a real weak point. Ruppia is an aquatic plant. It can absorb old carbon dissolved in the water it grows in, which can make radiocarbon dates read too old. It's called the reservoir effect, and it was a legitimate objection. For a moment it looked decisive. The footprints might be real, but far younger than claimed. Same answer as always. The evidence is fine, the date is wrong. Contamination, cousin of. So the team went back. And this is the part that matters. They didn't just re-argue, they redated using completely different methods that don't care about waterborne carbon at all. They dated ancient pollen from land plants, conifer pollen that got its carbon from the air, not the lake. And they used a technique called optical luminescence on quartz grains, which measures the last time those grains saw sunlight. 3 independent clocks, different physics, different assumptions, different failure points. Same answer. Around 21 to 23,000 years. Again, they tested it. Different method, same answer, tested it again, same answer. That is the sound of a date that will not move. And once 3 independent clocks agree, the plant-absorbed old carbon stops being an explanation and starts being a wish. The footprints are still debated. I won't pretend the case is closed, but something changed at White Sands that had never quite happened before. A modest, ordinary trace, the imprint of a bare foot in mud, turned out to be harder to kill than any dramatic skeleton. You can argue a bone got moved. You cannot argue a footprint fell into the wrong layer. Now go back to the Alaskan hearth for a second, because it just changed shape. If people were leaving footprints in New Mexico 22,000 years ago, then the ancient Beringians up in the north weren't the beginning of anything. They were a branch that stayed behind while others had already gone south. The genome of that infant stops being an origin story and becomes a snapshot of a population that got left in the north during a very long pause. The DNA and the footprints from opposite ends of 2 continents are describing the same slow, deep, complicated arrival. This is what the genetics actually shows, and it's beautiful. The data suggests a single founding population that had separated from Asians and Europeans and then sat somewhere isolated for thousands of years before splitting into the groups that would become Native Americans. Researchers call it the Beringian Standstill. People didn't sprint across a bridge, they stopped, they stayed. For generations, in the cold, in a place that's now partly underwater. And the ancient Beringians, the babies people, are the ghosts of that pause. That's the moment the whole thing clicks. The clean walking tour of the Americas was never a walk. It was a long wait and then a spreading out we can barely see. And now, because I promised you honesty, we have to walk out to the far, dangerous edge of this argument, the place most scientists refuse to go. Southern California, a site excavated in the early 1990s during highway construction called the Cerruti Mastodon Site. Bones of a mastodon, broken in ways that some researchers argued looked deliberate, with heavy stones nearby that could have been used to smash them for marrow. The claim, published in 2017, was that these bones had been broken by hominins, and the date they proposed was not 20,000 years, not 50. It was around 130,000 years ago. I want to be completely clear. Most archaeologists reject this, firmly, and they have good reasons. The far more likely explanation is that the bones were broken by the heavy construction equipment that uncovered them, or by natural geological forces over 100 millennia. There is no accepted evidence of humans in the Americas anywhere near that early, and no tools, no hearths, no human remains to go with it. So why am I even telling you about it? Because of what it reveals about the shape of the fight. 20 years earlier, a claim like Cerruti would have been laughed out of the room and forgotten in a week. Instead, it got published in Nature and argued about seriously enough to require serious rebuttal. Not because the evidence was strong, it isn't, but because the comfortable edge of the map was already gone. Once 13,000 became 23,000, the field lost its clean stopping point. And a discipline without a firm edge has a much harder time saying a thing is simply impossible. The lesson of Cerruti isn't that people were here 130,000 years ago. They almost certainly weren't. The lesson is that the humble footprint at White Sands is stronger evidence than the dramatic mastodon in California, and everyone in the field now knows it. The flashy skeleton loses, the bare footprint wins. That's not how the movies do it, but it's how this actually went. So what happened to Clovis first? The model that ruled for 60 years, that ended careers, that turned early dates into professional suicide. It didn't collapse. There was no press conference, no apology to Dillahay for the years he spent defending Monte Verde, no formal correction to the students who were taught that pre-Clovis meant careless and just quietly stopped being said. Textbooks softened their language. The first Americans arrived 13,000 years ago became the timing of the first arrival is debated. Museum labels got rewritten in gentler, vaguer wording. Papers appeared that treated pre-Clovis sites as normal objects of study, as if the brutal fight over them had never happened. The map changed shape in footnotes. The old model didn't burn, it changed clothes and walked out the back. And that's the thing about how science actually corrects itself. It's not a lie being exposed, it's certainty protecting itself for as long as it can, and then retreating so quietly that no one has to admit how hard they fought to keep the door shut. But there's one loose end, and it's the biggest one. If people were really spread across 2 continents that early, where is all the evidence? Where are the sites, the camps, the tools from those first thousands of years? Here's the leading answer, and it's the reason so much of this stays out of reach. They may have come down the coast, not through the interior, living off the sea and moving along a rich shoreline of kelp forests and shellfish and seals, what some researchers call the kelp highway. Boats, not just feet. Water, not just the corridor. And that coastline, the one they would have walked and paddled and camped on, is gone. Sea levels rose after the Ice Age. The shore those first people lived on is now hundreds of feet underwater, miles offshore, buried under ocean. Think about what that means. The inland archaeologists who spent decades insisting there was no early evidence may have been standing in the wrong place the entire time, not hiding the proof, just looking on dry land for a story that happened along a coast that no longer exists. The missing evidence wasn't destroyed by anyone. It was drowned by the sea. Which brings us back, one last time, to 2 infants under a hearth in Alaska. We can say some things for certain now. That baby's genome revealed a real, previously unknown population, the ancient Beringians. The peopling of the Americas was older, slower, and stranger than the clean model allowed. Monte Verde is real. White Sands is standing up to test after test. That much is verified. Other things stay disputed. The exact routes, the exact dates at the oldest edges, whether Karuti is anything at all, and some things we simply cannot recover because they're under the ocean now, in the dark, where no drawer opens and no brush reaches. But here's the turn I promised you at the beginning. The hardest question about that grave doesn't come from the establishment that resisted pre-Clovis dates for 60 years. It comes from the descendants, because the same native community that named those children Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Girl Child has raised real and difficult questions about the science being done on their ancestors' remains, about consent, about who gets to turn a buried child into a data point. The discovery everyone celebrated is contested on ground the textbook wars never touched. So picture it. A hearth in the Alaskan silt, 2 infants buried with care by people who grieved. A genome that pointed to a vanished population, and somewhere far to the south, a coastline sinking into the sea, still holding whatever's left of the first footsteps in a layer no one has learned how to read. The old story wasn't wrong because someone lied. It was wrong because it was too small, too clean, and too well defended. And most of what would prove it is still out there, drowned, mislabeled, or sitting in a drawer, waiting for the next test to come back with the same inconvenient answer it gave the last time.